Well, if you're joining me here today, you're coming to talk about Compose. You've probably talked a lot about Compose this weekend and familiarize yourself with that concept. Hopefully, I have some novel ideas here, something you guys can take away. We're going to be talking about not only Compose in the context of, technically what you could do to have interoperability, but also what it kind of means to bring Compose to a legacy code base and some of the kind of social engineering you have to do to bring that forward. Oh, there's my cursor. And there's me. Will the arrow keys play? No, that's okay. Anyways, this is me. My name is Dan Peluso. Does my click work? My click does work. Does my spacebar work? There we go. I'm an Android dev at Peloton. Been with here for just about a year. I'm an Android dev first. This is DroidCon, so I'll talk shop about Kotlin or MVVM every day. This is my first DroidCon, and I'm pretty excited to be here. Met a lot of fun folks. All my friends back home are back-end devs, so they just want to talk about like Spring Boot and full stack stuff, and I can't really keep up with that. But everyone here is down for Android, so it's pretty dope to be here. Now, I read Git logs for fun, I do have to say. I think there's a lot of story and history that can be pulled from a Git log. I'm fortunate enough to have only been doing software development while Git logs have had like full ticket links and documentations. So you can kind of like read a story of like the cultural history of a company, I think. Who was big on this pattern, who kind of decided to introduce this there. I'm also an amateur percussionist, as you can see in this image here. I play in a band called Spiderwater. This is our website. It is written in Flutter, so if that's going to be enough to make you leave the room, then I understand where you're coming from. Now, I've been a Compose user since 2019. Really, this is kind of when I started Android development, and given that I am a relatively new grad, Compose was kind of something that I learned in parallel with doing legacy Android development. So really, since I've been drawing XMLs, I've been getting frustrated with them and trying to put Compose views and such in the way. I've also been a part of Compose adoptions at 3 different software companies. The first was a startup that was basically using Compose for anything. There wasn't really an existing code base. The second was another company that was kind of moving from a startup to sort of like a hyperscale kind of event. This is like 2020 era, you got to think. So health tech was just booming at the time. They kind of adopted Compose there as well, and I was one of the code monkeys who kind of contributed to that. And then finally, Peloton has really made some pretty big pushes within the last year to introduce Compose into our code base as well. And so I've learned quite a bit about what happens in the, quote, Compose crusade period of a company. That is kind of where we're at right now in Peloton, and hopefully you guys can learn a little bit about our story. I thought that was going to be a little bit less visible, but I also occasionally forget how to use a recycler view. Just recently, I forgot to do the layout manager, which is like a classic step, but you don't have to worry about that with lazy lists. Anywho, we're going to be going over 2 big points today, and that is really just, and once again, I'm going to cook through the speaker view, just adding Compose to a legacy code base, and sort of like some of the libraries that you can use to make that happen. And then also really socializing Compose and kind of getting people behind the curve and really getting your team excited about using this new framework. I made a little graph here. I was told that graphs do well at these sorts of things. So this is kind of the journey that we're going to be taking, my descent into madness, I like to think about it as. So yeah, let's get started with Compose. So a pretty big question on everyone's mind when talking about Compose is, oh man, like why do we want to use Compose? And I thought, what would a Compose presentation be if I didn't really go over just exemplary some of the benefits of it and maybe why you'd want to use it? That's actually a joke. There's no way I'm going to spend your guys' time doing that. If you're here, you probably already have some interest in Compose. I imagine that you guys probably would like to implement it at some point. And there's a lot of other people who are probably more technically extensive than me who can explain the why for it. So let's kind of assume that you as a developer do want to use Compose. Really, the question becomes more like this. You have the senior vice president of software. Ours is a spider. And you really have to justify why are we recreating all these views? What is like the real benefit of bringing this to the company? And that's a little bit trickier of a question to frame. there's a lot of reasons why people wouldn't want to use it. And they are pretty valid, right? Android is a pretty dynamic ecosystem, as I'm sure you're all familiar with. Even when I started in 2019, you might catch someone writing live data responses for repositories and using an async task to fetch that info. I mean, there's really no standard with this sort of stuff. It's kind of the Wild West. The performance concerns are pretty valid, definitely. And, when you're investing in Compose, I'd like to think that you're not necessarily investing in just this specific library, but you're investing in the idea of declarative UI as the future of writing front-end development. And so maybe Compose isn't the perfect solution for declarative UI, but let's take some examples outside of the Android ecosystem. You have React Native, you have Swift UI, you have Flutter, all of these kind of using these hierarchical approaches. And it seems like the benefits and kind of the software principles that focuses is something that genuinely makes the experience a little bit better. So if you've been able to get that through, let's kind of talk through a specific example and go through the Peloton case. So our first foray into Compose was, like a lot of other companies, building a watch OS app. Now, the folks who did this were sort of the pioneers of Compose at our company, really adding all the dependencies in, making some of that basic infrastructure, getting kind of the core of theming working in. They really kind of planted the seeds for the rest of the work that we would be doing with Compose. I think that this team, kind of drew this watch OS inspiration for some other companies as well. I don't know if anyone from here anyone in here is from Tinder, but they actually had a pretty cool blog post about this sort of thing that was pretty influential to our company at the time. Basically, we thought of it as, well, we don't have a Wear OS app. How can we kind of put Compose onto something that's going to be low risk and potentially a good use case for it? Thankfully, the Google team was really kind of investing in Wear OS as a viable Compose option. So we decided to kind of make that our first alpha. Now, this went pretty well. As you can see on the left there, and maybe if you were watching Google I/O, you noticed that we actually did get a shout out at the time, and we had some employees there who were sharing a little bit about it. That was the big headline, that we saw an uptick in user engagement. Very exciting stuff. And so that went great, and we were all incredibly excited about it. And what it really meant was that, okay, now we can kind of get to work. We can start using Compose in other spaces. So the first thing I would recommend is start with kind of a simple project. It can be enticing to replace every single recycler view you have with a lazy list or a column, but there's obviously going to be a lot of risk associated with that, and it's much easier to sort of get a following behind doing something more simple. So a Wear OS app is a pretty good way to go into it. Now let's kind of talk about moving forward with that. If you read Compose docs, as I often do, you can kind of go through and see this really sort of ideal space where everyone's using Compose for everything. And it can be a little intimidating at times. What I've noticed is that there's a lot of absolutes in Compose. And, it kind of makes it seem like if you just wanted to add one small thing in Compose, they talk about interoperability. But then you see testimonials like this. Dropbox rewrote the entire search experience using Compose in just a matter of weeks. I don't know about you guys, but that's kind of a terrifying thought. I mean, just think of the business stakes if your search feature goes wrong in your Dropbox. I mean, that's pretty risky. Mercari, I mean, I don't know, what's in the water at Mercari offices, but my goodness gracious, they rewrote the entire app in Compose. There's people who won't even, write that at all, but this is the main testimonial on their website. Even at DroidCon before, we've talked about design systems, and this is another presentation from, I believe, DroidCon Italy. Rewriting a design system from scratch is kind of tricky if you don't have a project to necessarily do that with. So how can we kind of, address these problems and move forward? It's not always feasible to go to Compose right away. You can, have interoperability aspects that have to deal with legacy parts of your own code base, let alone adding a new language framework. Maybe you have a new tech library already added. Let's say you want to have some kind of backend call that you don't have existing in your app before. It can be kind of tricky to justify a new UI as well as a new backend that you have to support. And developing these new components is going to take time, and it will probably blow up the deadlines of some of these earlier components. So it is kind of hard to get that justified. These are all really valid concerns about why you probably wouldn't want to use Compose, but there are kind of some responses that you can use to reframe that question. Likely, if you're doing any interoperability, you're probably going to have to navigate anyways. And luckily with Compose, there are a lot of ways to make it work clean with an activity. If you want to use a nav host, some of these things are pretty lightweight for basic features. And that's definitely fair if you don't want to have two projects or two different pieces of technology in a new project. But maybe you can pick a project that doesn't really have a lot of business requirements. Maybe a rewriting of a screen that the logic is already pretty set in stone. And yes, it definitely will take time to build some of those initial pieces of Vue, but maybe you could pick a project that has pretty modular UI. So you could take advantage of kind of atomic design in this sense. You could kind of make things and then it will propagate throughout everything that you're building on that screen. You can consider it an investment in infrastructure if you're talking to the higher ups at the company. They love that word. So maybe you want to try building something from scratch. It's good for a lot of reasons. Like I said, really sort of starting off building some of that atomic design and getting your Compose infrastructure is a pretty good way to do it. So maybe you want to add your own wrappers around things and build stuff from scratch. So at Peloton, this is exactly what we decided to do. We took Compose to the big leagues. Oh yeah. The watch, obviously, what a small league. We're talking like an inch radius on this thing. The Peloton tablet is like 24 inches, folks. This is a lot more room for having Vue. So how did we do it? Just to kind of give some context on the Peloton product suite, we have our bikes, our rowers, and our treadmills, and they all have this fancy schmancy tablet right there, and it's all running Android. I think that's a big reason why we're involved in the community, and it's actually a very cool thing about working for Peloton. It's like one of the rare cases of having many more Android developers than iOS devs. So we finally outnumber them. It's a dub in my book. But all of these are using the Peloton proprietary software on it. It's a lot higher risk. We have to manage not only releases of our app version, but releases of the system image. We have to maintain different types of this. I mean, you have Peloton bikes that people have in their home, sure, but what about all the commercial devices as well? That's kind of running a little bit of a different system. Here we go. So this is kind of the project that we decided would be a good one here. Now, if you've been working with any Android preference view libraries, you could kind of recognize a lot of the familiar line separators and UI here. We have our classic checkboxes. There's a pretty drastic font change in between the side menu and the actual content on it. One of these has a check on it that's a blue that I'm pretty sure our designer would have an aneurysm if they saw that on. The managed red, it's a little bit different. It's basically using the original kind of Android preference UI library. That worked great at the time, and really this is one of those features that's like, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. I mean, not many people are spending all their time on the settings. But if you'd like to kind of invest in the Compose infrastructure, we thought this is kind of the perfect screen to do it. There's not a ton of back-end changes that have to happen here. We can restyle things. I mean, clearly you can even just see here, there's a lot of modular design involved. So how do we kind of move that forward? Well, the way that we kind of did it was, and I know I was knocking on that company for using a design system, but you do have to start somewhere. We did start with our design system. The overall screen designs were made first, sort of a standard thing. We kind of, as a team, broke those into atomic components. If you're not familiar with atomic design, just basically this diagram kind of points it out well. Atoms would be things like buttons, text views. A molecule would be anything that combines those. So maybe a single line list item could be an example of a molecule. An organism would be something like a row of maybe single line list items, or a radio group that potentially uses list item molecules. So we broke these up. We started implementing components from the bottom up. And then we kind of put those together and decided what they would look like. And so this image kind of shows basically how we extracted things. We decided, okay, we need a lot of list view items here. We need, obviously, our dialogues. We have our inputs and everything. We've kind of established this. Well, everything looks pretty easy to do and compose. This is kind of the next step for us. Now, a takeaway from this is that it is pretty tricky to decide, just looking at a design, what the base component should have. I mean, just look at the center screen here with the list items. all of these kind of have little differences in them. You need the radio button, you need to be able to support icons, maybe there's a different type of header. If you look, there's differences in the rounded corner edges. I mean, that's already a conditional modifier that you have to add in. Like, these sorts of things are kind of tricky to come across beforehand. Did this go back a slide? Oh, no. Well, we ended up implementing that, and this is sort of the result of that change. We have all of our list items here. You can see everything follows a much cleaner style. That is definitely our red hex code. I've looked at it a million times, I can promise you. We have our sweet organisms here. We even have our nice date picker involved. That's actually a little bit more challenging than it seems. Really what you can take away from this is that Compose definitely has its limitations. There's certainly no denying that. You are adopting a library earlier on in its life, and so naturally there are going to be some sort of limitations with that. But I put the asterisk there because I sincerely believe that with enough elbow grease and enough can-do attitude, they can be overcome, folks, and it is worth it in the end. Now, let's kind of follow through a case study to just kind of illustrate what this actually would look like. So this is a quote that you probably have heard from a designer when opening up any material date picker. Really, I mean, I'm all for kind of the church of the material design, but I do believe also that enterprise companies have their own style guidelines, and that's not really something that you can modify as a designer or really put input on. Potentially it'd be easier if some of those APIs are more open, but that's unfortunately not the way it is in kind of the younger library. This is just sort of what the material date picker looks like if you guys haven't seen it before. Really just, incredibly googly, and for the right reasons, that's fine, but it's not for everyone. So how can we kind of move this forward? And this is where we go into the next step into madness, interoperability, which you guys are all here for today. So first, let's talk about Android View, or the shortcomings of a new library. As you kind of saw with the date picker, the one that I had in that last dialog was pretty different than what you saw in the Compose view. That was because we're wrapping a Java view using the Android View API. Android View is kind of a last-ditch effort sort of a thing. Really, if you find you're using Compose and there's something that is giving you a lot of trouble, maybe you are working with a deadline to work on Compose. I mean, if you want to prove to higher ups that Compose is going to save developer time, you'd like to do things quickly, right? Potentially, if they don't want to fit to that style, this is where you can introduce an Android View. Sometimes the scope of actually recreating a component could be much too large. There's a lot involved in a date picker, right? I don't know if you guys have ever kind of built date pickers or worked with the logic of it, but the amount of edge cases are just absolutely insane. So if you have all these engineers who 5 years ago grinded on this, you want to build upon them. You don't want to replace what they were doing exactly. So we decided to build our Android View. Now, in a legacy context, the way that you would kind of update views, as you're probably familiar with, is you'd kind of get a new view state, have a reference to something in the XML tree with your ID, and then you would put that immediately on the relevant view. That worked great for that context, but within a Compose view, it's going to be a little bit different. Your view state is no longer kind of done in a straight ID to ID reference. It's propagated through the tree. So when you're updating an Android view, really there's kind of two segments that you have. There's the initial creation of it. This is kind of, you can think of it as the onCreate section of building an Android view. And then you have your factory function, which you also need to pass into the constructor. That's what's going to handle the new state. So just to kind of illustrate what that sort of looks like here. There are some differences between these two. In the factory context, it calls the constructor of the view. You can attach any XML styles here. Any functions that set initial state should probably be done there. Whereas the update function is what's getting called every time the new state comes in. These are mostly public functions. It often changes more than a legacy usage. So for example, if you have a time picker where you want to set the range of that time picker, you could try doing it in the factory function, and maybe that works. But let's say in the date picker example, you're going to a month where you haven't reached every day in it. You don't want the users to go to a day that hasn't happened yet in that month. Well, in that case, you need to actually include your date range in the update function. So you have to think a little bit creatively about where you can sort of place these things. Now, this is kind of what I was dealing with when I encountered our date picker and picked up that ticket. I think it was like 2 points. It's just egregiously underrepresented. But I had an ancient scroll on my hand that was, of course, styles.xml. Now, there's nothing wrong with this. When people were building that original date picker component, that was how you changed the date picker, right? You'd put this inside of some XML file, change around some attributes, and everything worked fine. Well, in an Android view context, that doesn't necessarily work. You can't really update the styles as much, or maybe you just want to reuse styles that hardworking engineers have already taken advantage of. Well, in that case, just kind of admit it. Sometimes what works, works. If you have the XML styles for this, you should take advantage of them. And it's a little tricky, but you actually can do it with Android View. This is kind of a code example of one of our number pickers. It has been doctored, for the record. But just to kind of show you, we have the number picker at the top level, which calls a child component, the Peloton picker. And then actually the last argument you can see is a Lambda function that actually creates the Java view, our accessibility number picker. Now, you might be thinking, what's really the reason for hoisting it? Why aren't you calling the Android view directly? Well, yes, you want to have a generic picker for numbers, but you might also want a picker for strings, right? Your month names in there. Those might have different styles between them. So really, it kind of switches from using just a regular context to actually using a context theme provider. In the example here, we're definitely an accessibility first company. I'm dealing with talkback tickets all the time. I'm pretty sure I've pissed off my entire apartment just having talkback, refresh the screen and just waste its way through our front message. Your accessibility needs to be able to respond to configuration changes. And if this is something that you're attaching at a higher level, and maybe the state isn't changing on the child level, you're going to want to be able to adapt to that. So you have to actually lift the accessibility higher in the composable tree to respond to those changes. And then you can see on the inside of the class, that's actually or inside of the composable function, almost made a fatal mistake there calling a composable function a class. I do apologize. We have our actual Android view here. Once again, a couple modifiers get attached to it. Our factory is pretty straightforward, but this is where we actually can attach the style. Our context theme wrapper kind of goes in here, and we call that parent lambda. The update functions, as I kind of mentioned, you're updating the values of the spinner, as well as sort of the display values and limits that you have on that. So sometimes you got to think outside of the box if you're using Android View. You've already kind of decided that you want to intertwine these libraries together, so you're probably no stranger to thinking creatively. But kind of decide where things lie in the composable tree. Because sometimes they do have effects, similar to how if you chain modifiers in the wrong order, you're going to end up with something completely different. This is just kind of what happens with these interop libraries. So I got a picture of me after we finished this project. I was feeling pretty cool, had all my shiny new composables. I don't know about you guys, but I was kind of the kid on Christmas or birthdays that would just open all my presents right away. And so, yeah, I wanted to use my new toys. We had some engineers in the background a little horrified about the pace we were working with. But let's say you get a new project and you have a little bit of compose infrastructure and you want to add that to a legacy screen. Well, this is where you kind of hit the twin of the Android view, the compose view, or as I like to refer to it, refusing to work with XML. Compose views are really just a compose component put in the XML tree. So you can use all your new styles within a legacy screen. If you're hesitant to refactor an entire screen to work with compose, maybe it's a risky flow. In our example here, we had a new language selector on top of a screen that was written in 2016. I don't know about you guys, but I was a little bit less willing to work with the RX intertwinings of a very, very important flow. So I kind of decided to slap a compose view on top of that. Now, additionally, you get to use compose infrastructure. And so because of this, you can make a design decision. Maybe you want to add something on top of the existing functionality and not change any risky code. You can kind of use state flows and observables on top of it as long as you're inflating that properly. In XML, it looks just the same as any other component would. I have it in the context of a constraint layout here, pretty straightforward. In Kotlin, it's even easier. Really, you can see we have the set content function. If you've worked with Compose in an activity context, you're pretty familiar with that. One important thing is that you do want to attach your theme and do any state observations actually with inside the composable function here. Remember that collect as state needs a composable context. So you actually have to do some state management after you've already kind of set the UI for that screen. And then we have our function right here. Pretty straightforward. Our view model kind of exposed a state flow with our locale already. And then calling some public functions, we were able to work with this pretty squarely. And I'm behind on my speaker notes, but here we go. There are kind of some design considerations that you can make with this. One thing is that, you have your new view state. In the old way, like I said, it would kind of directly call the view. Compose view, again, kind of forces you to think differently in that manner. There's sort of two ways you could do it if you're adding it to a legacy screen. One way is kind of this piece here. Your new view state and potentially your view state infrastructure already exists. Maybe you can supply the data on top of that. Now, keep in mind, you do kind of have to introduce the observability concept in as well, so you will need a hot flow that you can convert into a state flow to be able to react to that within your composable. But if you can do this, from a software principles standpoint, you're kind of a rock star, right? Like you're able to plug into the legacy, you have it in on top of it, and that works just fine. Sometimes it's not always that easy. In my case, I really did not want to touch the flow, so I kind of made a new exposed flow that was kind of independent from the existing legacy options that would go on top of it. Really, when you're doing this, you want to decide the best way to get state here. There are a lot of options to consider, and what's important is that you adapt it to your use case. In ours, it didn't really make a ton of sense to open up the legacy views and sort of mess with that flow, especially when the functionality itself didn't really rely on other things happening in that screen. But in some cases, that could be seen as a violation of some software principles, right? You technically now are exposing multiple things there. If you're an Android developer, hopefully you're okay bending the rules a little bit for a use case. So decide what's kind of reasonable for your company and move forward with what do you think is going to work best for your use case. Now, into the final step into madness, you've managed to put Compose inside of a bunch of XMLs. Maybe you have entire features written in Compose, but you still have teams who are working on stuff that maybe isn't as easy as just checkboxes and setting screens and such. How do you really socialize Compose and bring it to a greater audience? This is, as I mentioned, the social engineering part, the type Stack Overflow can't help you with. Although, weirdly enough, there is you'll go to Stack Overflow sometimes, and people will start to get kind of real emotionally. I always read the lowest tier answers because I feel bad for them. Because I myself am not even allowed to ask questions on Stack Overflow, just copy and paste. But anyways, this is what you want to happen, right? Ideally, people are moving towards Kotlin. You can get rid of XML. It's a lot trickier to work with. How do you kind of inspire this sort of rampant behavior in your organization? Well, I'm not sure I have the end-all, be-all answer for everyone, but I can kind of share with you how at Peloton we did it and what we think is working well for inspiring our engineers to include Compose. Now, the first thing we kind of did was create a work group that kind of met on a bi-weekly basis here. These are started by the folks who built that first Wear OS app, as I was mentioning before. Really just a rogue Slack channel. It could even be where people are just asking any sort of questions. As I kind of alluded to earlier, we had many, many questions about chaining modifiers, how to have that infrastructure work. It could be something that's silly about maybe forgetting a theme or in your preview having things go wrong or discussing what kind of lint rules you want to add to your organization. Getting the conversation started in kind of a low-risk, friendly atmosphere was really beneficial to us. Additionally, we had that big profile refactor. What we wanted to do was present our findings and final product to everybody. So we made a huge deal about this. Nobody cared as much about profile settings as our team. And we got up there and we were, doing some big dancing and a big presentation about this. Like, let's go, sharing everybody the magic of Compose. You have to act excited about this. And we were excited, right? It took way less time and, it was way less of a headache to work with these types of views. So if you had fun and you enjoyed it, go ahead and present with it and kind of bring that forward. Additionally, we had a company hackathon, and this is something that a lot of companies are doing. pushing Compose on this is a really good opportunity to get people to use it. In my case, I kind of volunteered to be the educator about Compose. So I gave an internal presentation at a hackathon. Any group that was trying to do something, I would join the channel and be like, this project seems so sick. Like, this Compose would work great there. Then leave the channel. Even if you're just kind of sprinkling those breadcrumbs in. It's an experimental time in a company, a hackathon. This is the time to have fun. Compose is kind of the perfect use case for that. Additionally, having multiple teams sort of share this dependency. I've worked at companies where there was kind of one team developing all of the Compose stuff, sort of tucked into their corner that had releases of new molecules and such. And I think that worked well at the time, but seeing kind of the way that we did it at Peloton, where multiple teams kind of had stake in the game, it really forces other parts of the company to look at Compose seriously and bring it forward and, having that dependency across whatever front-end teams you have is a really good way to get multiple groups to invest in it and start becoming familiar with the code at the very least. This is actually a picture from the internal project I gave. I sent a screenshot or a picture to my mom, and she said, "That's the wrong then," and that was her only reaction. My first big presentation, so I've corrected it here. It was an incredibly embarrassing moment, but I thought it would be humbling. Build the community. Compose is more than just a framework in that sense, more than code, I suppose. It's about really taking risks and deciding that Kotlin is like the one true language that you love to write. Anytime I open up a Java file, it like hurts me inside. And anytime I write XML, like I'm just, I feel like a shadow of the man that I once knew. But with Compose, everything is magical. Building that community helped immensely with that. If you recognize this image, as they said in Field of Dreams, if you build the Compose community, the developers will come. And these are the developers at Peloton. So I think I'm going to come a little bit under time, but that's okay. It's been a long day for everybody. Here are really just some big takeaways that we had during our time at Compose, or using Compose. Ooh, getting ahead of myself. Development time is really the best upgrade of Compose. Not only development time for, once we had it, we were cruising, we were pumping out views quicker than ever. Our designers were getting exhausted with how we were sending them QA so quickly. But even developer time is in, man, we were having a good time. I mean, Compose, that is a great library, let me tell you. It's fun, it's a new way of thinking about things. It's novel. The playing field is level. There's still times where you could go into Compose and Kotlin Slack and you can ask questions and be talking to people who wrote that library. It's a really good time to work in this, and you will be working a lot quicker, but definitely the speed at which you will be able to build front ends is massive, attributed probably to just previews alone, right? And being able to have these modular components also makes a really big difference. For your first refactor, it definitely is better to go low risk. For us, that was the Wear OS app, and then kind of moving to our main product suite. Introducing the profile settings was something that was, again, considered low risk just because of the domain and the existing infrastructure that we had there. It can be tempting to use some new Compose library to go into something risky. But to be honest, if you do suggest something like that to someone in senior software, they're probably just going to reject it anyways. So it's better to just pick something low risk before you even go to them with it. One thing that I personally liked the most about Compose was just the style consistency and how it really propagated across everything in our view. And that was important because not only were developers able to not have to think about how a certain button should be styled or, should we use the large, small, like how wide something could be when it's in the context of this view, that would kind of automatically go up. But even when developing, a lot of the times we'd get a new screen for profile settings and a designer would give us a button width or a button with text size that we've never seen before. Compose has those barriers kind of built in, right? We don't allow you to change those things when we build these atomic libraries on purpose. So our developers would go to the designers and say, I'm sorry, this actually isn't in the design system. It's kind of a funny reversal of roles, but Compose really puts up those barriers to allow that to happen. One last big takeaway that we have here is that setting up benchmarking early on is really going to be very important. Now, benchmarking could be a screen load time. It could be measuring performance, looking at some of those really nice views that they have in Android Studio for actually kind of figuring out how you want to monitor this. But in our case, it would have helped a lot to have snapshot testing earlier on, especially when you're building these core components. Folks are adding things to them as soon as a new product requirement comes up, and you don't really know what the side effects are going to be to those unless you really build out a snapshot infrastructure. This is something that we kind of learned after the fact, and hopefully you guys can use to speed up your improvement with Compose. But setting up snapshot testing can save you a lot of headaches from earlier on if you're able to set that up. And definitely screen load times and performance things are going to be important when you want to justify this to senior management. And I believe that is all I have for today. Thank you guys so much for hearing me out. Specifically, there's some people in the room I want to thank. Thanks to Kevin Z for kind of encouraging me to apply to this and for telling me I should do a DroidCon talk. And I want to thank Rich and the whole Android team for fielding all my questions. The Codebase is pretty tricky to navigate, but I had a lot of helpful engineers along the way. And lastly, just the entire Android team at Peloton. Everyone is very, very excited about these new libraries, and it's an incredibly supportive community for these sorts of things. I don't think we would have been able to progress without that. Thank you.